In economics, when we want to understand prices and quantities, we have to look at supply and demand. And so in this video, we're going to look specifically at supply. So when a firm supplies a good or service, or a person, it could be a person, it could be a company, it could be a firm, when they supply a good or service, a couple of conditions have to exist. One is there has to be resources and technology available to produce it. Secondly, the person producing it has to be able to profit from it. Otherwise, why would they bother to go to the trouble of producing it and supplying it? And again, there has to be a definite plan to produce and supply something. We don't produce and sell it. We don't talk about something as being part of supply if it's just an idea or a thought or even certain things that are under development or being researched, if they're not really in a stage where they involve definite plans to produce it and sell something. And so for firms or for people who are supplying goods and services, resources that are available and the technology that's available determine what's possible to produce. And so supply reflects decisions about which items are both technologically feasible, where the resources are available, and eventually they have to also be economically feasible. So resources and technology are a big determinant of supply. Now, we talk about the quantity supplied. Well, that's the amount of good or service that's going to be supplied, be available, that producers plan to make and to sell at any particular price. And so we have a law of supply, which is analogous to the law of demand. It's just the opposite. So the law of supply says the higher the price of a good, well, the greater is the quantity supplied. And conversely, the lower the price of the good, the smaller is the quantity supplied. And there's a common sense part of this. If you're building products and selling them, the higher the prices, the more motivated you are to supply more of them. The quantity demand is going to be higher. And so this also results from a general tendency for marginal costs, for the incremental cost of producing goods and services to increase as I try to produce more of them. So not only am I motivated to supply more when the prices are higher, but in order for me to be able to supply more, I have to be able to get higher prices in order to cover my increased marginal costs. So producers are only going to be willing to supply more of a product if they can cover the marginal costs, which are higher when they're producing more. So we can look at a supply curve, which is an embodiment of a supply schedule. It's also a graphical depiction of the law of supply, and it basically shows that it's upward sloping. The higher the price, the greater is the quantity supplied. The lower the price, the lesser is the quantity supplied. And you can easily see that by looking at points A and E, and really all the points between A and E. And so this supply curve shows the relationship between the quantity supplied at all the different possible price points. And when we look at that, all those possible combinations, that's what we call supply. Supply refers to the entire relationship between the quantity supplied and all the possible prices for a good. And again, the law of supply tells us that this curve is an upward sloping curve. So we can see here that an increase in the price of a product brings an increase in the quantity supplied. If we go from the price, if we go from point C where the price is $3 to point A where the price is $5, the quantity supplied goes from 32 to 60. There's an increase in the quantity supplied, resulting from an increase in the price. And again, part of the reason why the supply curve is upward sloping is because marginal costs increase. The incremental costs that I incur producing goods and services increases as I produce more of them, I have to be able to cover those incremental costs, those marginal costs, and so as a supplier, I require higher prices in order to supply more. So firms will need a higher price in order to cover those increased costs. That's part of the reason why the law of supply holds and exists, and part of the reason why the curve is upward sloping. The supply curve is upward sloping. Now, we talk about a movement along the curve when there's a change in the price of a good or service, but no other changes. Everything else remains the same. If prices are higher, there'll be an increase in the quantity supplied, and if prices are lower, there's a decrease in the quantity supplied. But the curve itself doesn't change. This is important. As a movement along the curve, we can have an increase or decrease in the quantity supplied. But the supply curve itself, the entire relationship between prices and quantities, remains the same. We contrast that with an actual change in supply when there's some influence other than the price which changes, and when some influence causes supply to increase, well, the curve will move from S1 to S3, from the black curve to the green curve, and the green curve represents a greater quantity supplied at each and every price point. Now, conversely, if we decrease supply, the curve will move from S1 to S2. There's a lower quantity supplied at each and every point on the supply curve. And so when the whole curve moves, we say that supply shifts. Supply either increases or decreases. Now, what can cause a curve to shift? What can cause supply or to increase or decrease? Well, there's 6 factors that can change supply, and you're going to look at the list here, but we'll go through each of them. One of them is the prices of the factors of production. So if a price of one of the factors of production that's used to produce a good or services increases, well, then the supply of that product will decrease. And we can use the example of lemons and lemonade. So lemons are an ingredient to produce lemonade. If the price of lemons increases, the supply of lemonade decreases. The amount of lemonade people can supply at each and every price point is less than it was before the price of the factor of production, in this case lemons, increased. Now, the opposite is true if the price of a factor of production decreases. If the price of a factor of production decreases, well, then supply will increase. Suppliers can make more than they could previously at the same price points, and therefore they can supply more of a good or service. The quantity of the amount supplied can be greater for each and every price point. So the prices of the factors of production are one of the things that determines supply, and when they change, supply will change along with it. And in this case, they're kind of inversely related. If the price of a factor of production increases, then the supply of the product the factor of production is used to produce decreases, and vice versa. Now, another thing that can change supply is the price of related goods produced, and this one is a little trickier. There are some things that are called substitutes in production. So a substitute in production is when a resource, a factor of production, can be used to produce more than one thing. Well, the things that it can be used to produce are kind of competing with each other for the factor of production. So if a good, if the price of a substitute in production rises, the supply of a good will decrease. Let's look at an example. Let's say that corn, that's a factor of production, can be used to produce corn chips or ethanol, a fuel that that uses corn to produce. So the corn can be used for two things: corn chips or ethanol. If the price of ethanol increases, well, more of the corn is going to go to ethanol. The ethanol providers will be able to pay more, and therefore less of the corn will go to corn chips. So the supply of corn chips will decrease. So the best way to think about this is to just think about the fact that something like corn is a factor of production. It can be used to produce more than one thing, and the things that it can be used to produce are kind of competing with each other for that factor of production. If the price of a substitute in a production process increases, then the supply of the other product, the original product, will decrease, and vice versa. If the price of ethanol were to go down, for example, well, more of the corn, which is the factor used to produce both corn chips and ethanol, would go towards corn chips. Corn chip providers will be able to pay more than the ethanol providers for that corn, and so as a result, the supply of corn the supply of corn chips would increase. Another so factors of production can be either they can also be complements. There can be complements in production rather than substitutes in production. So a complement in production are two things that get produced and work better together. And if the price of a complement production rises, well, the supply of the other good will also rise. Think about paint and paintbrushes. Paint and paintbrushes are complements in production. They work better together than they do individually or on their own. So they're complements in production. So if the price of paint rises, well, people are going to need they're going to need more paintbrushes also. And so paintbrushes, which go along with paint, the supply of paintbrushes will also increase. Said another way, if the value of the two things together increases, people are willing to pay more for the paint. They're also willing to pay more for the paintbrushes. And the law of supply says if the price is higher, then the supply will be greater. So in this case, since they're complements in production, the price of the paint going up will bring the supply of the paintbrushes up along with it, because the two things work together. The two things are valued in a sense together, and so if the price of the paint increases, the supply of paintbrushes will also increase. Now, expectations about future prices can be one of the things that changes supply. If we're expecting, for example, maybe for the price of oil to go up in the future, maybe there's some instability in the world in an oil-producing region. Maybe there might be people worried about a war or something like that. Well, they're not going to wait for that to happen. If we're expecting the prices to go up in the future, we actually supply less today. We withhold some of the supply. Why do we do that? Because we want to wait until the price goes up. So if we're expecting the price to be higher tomorrow, we withhold some of the product today, and then when the price does go up, we supply more tomorrow. So, and if we have an expectation that prices are going to be higher in the future, supply decreases today. Now, the number of suppliers is a direct determinant of the amount of supply. If there's more suppliers, then supply is greater. If there's less supply, then supply is lower. So if we think about a particular area, you might have one bagel shop in an area. If you have a second one open up across the street, then the supply of the whole curve will shift. The whole curve will increase. If there used to be two stores and one of them closes down, well, the supply will decrease and the whole curve shifts leftward. If you remember, we talked about the fact that resources and technology are direct determinants of what people are able to supply. So when there's an advancement in technology, well, that means that with the given amount of resources, people are able to be more productive, they're able to produce more. So advances in technology allow supply to increase and shift the curve rightwards. And this is one of the reasons why innovation and technology development is so important in an economic system, because it allows us to advances in technology allow us to produce more with the same amount of resources and 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 um, and increase the amount, the supply, the quantity supplied, and the supply of goods and services. And another factor that determines supply or can change supply is nature. The state of nature includes really, any of the natural forces of the world, the weather, natural events, disasters, and things like that can change supply. If there's a hurricane in the Gulf and some of the places that we get our oil from are disrupted or destroyed, then supply will be decreased until those things can be corrected and fixed and put back online. So nature can disrupt supply and production and cause and be one of the factors that causes supply to decrease or increase for that matter. Now, again, remember we talk about a movement along the supply curve where the supply curve stays the same. The supply hasn't changed. Because there's a higher or lower price, there's a increase or decrease in supply. We're at a different point on the existing supply curve. We talk about the quantity supplied increasing or the quantity supplied decreasing, but supply itself stays the same. There's no change in the graph that we're looking at in supply. We're at different points along the supply curve. We have a movement along the supply curve, and we compare and contrast this with a change to the supply curve itself. How can we have a change in the supply curve? Well, one of the 6 factors that can change supply has to change, and then we can have an increase or a decrease in supply. And when we have an increase in supply, the supply curve moves to the right. The quantity supplied at every price point is larger. When we have a decrease in supply, the curve moves to the left from S1 to S2. And at every price point, we have a lesser amount being supplied than we did at S2 than we did in S1. And so this is a distinction between a movement along the curve and where supply doesn't change, just the quantity supplied either increases or decreases, and a movement of the whole curve itself. In this case, we say that supply changed, not just the quantities, but the whole curve moves. And it can be, if it increases, it goes to the right, and decreases, it goes to the left. And so this is supply. Remember, the law of supply says the higher the price, the greater is the quantity supplied. The lower the price, the lesser is the quantity supplied. Supply is determined by the amount of available resources that we have and by the technology that's available to us. And if supply increases or decreases, if the whole curve shifts, the only way that happens is if one of the 6 factors that can change supply changes in some way, shape, or form.